Hello, everyone. It's me, Mr. Huffman, again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching this. So, as we're moving into some more stuff through Unit 4, and we're going to have a lot more kind of in the coming weeks that is kind of going to be more directly important as far as the direct political, social, economic directions of the country. This one's going to be a little bit more discreet. It's a little bit off the beaten track at the time, but when we look back now, this turned out to be a lot of important reforms that are going to be taking place, and reform movements especially. Many of these reform movements aren't going to be super successful at the moment, at the time, but they're really going to feed into some things that we might not even talk about just in American 1, but even going into American 2 as well over the course of the rest of the 19th and early 20th century. And a lot of that deals with just reforming society, right? It's from outside, people outside of the White House, outside of the Congress, outside of Washington, D.C., who make the decisions at the grassroots level all across America. And it's these grassroots folks and these grassroots movements that are going to have drastic consequences positively in the decades and century to come. Okay, so again, as I said, a lot of this stuff was under the radar at the moment, at the time when it happened in the 18 teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, but in the long run are going to be incredibly important. And this whole idea of the voluntary energies of the nation itself, what does that mean? Really, a lot of these reform movements I'm going to be talking about are going to be heavily inspired by the Second Great Awakening, which I think I'll touch more on in another lecture. But there is going to be a Second Great Awakening, and that really stirs the energies and the values of a great deal of variety of people all throughout the United States. Excuse me. So a minister by the name of Lyman Beecher, he says that, hey, we need to insist upon societal improvements, and they should come from individuals, not the government. So there is going to be debate to the extent to which the federal, state, or local governments should institute reforms and new policies, and the push and pull between that and the notion that individuals themselves are going to institutionally and societally improve the society. So that's going to be a big debate. Should the kind of individuals do it themselves, or should the government step in and do it on a larger level? Okay. And Beecher and other reformers say, hey, they're going to found these societies known as benevolent societies. And they're basically kind of good faith groups that are working to spread the word of God and converting non-believers, but also that's going to really be stirred out of that Second Great Awakening. But after that, they said, all right, we've saved people, we've turned people to Christ or to Jesus. Now we need to kind of take that same energy and apply it to actually combating social problems. So we're not just leaving it in the church on Sundays or Wednesdays or whenever they're meeting. We'll take that energy, that faithfulness to Christ, and translate that into actually fighting some social problems, which not all churches were doing, but a certain amount of churches are going to try to start doing during this time. And what's important about a lot of these benevolent societies are there's an overwhelming presence of women. Women especially are going to start being more and more motivated to join these, and in general are going to join in much larger numbers than men. Unmarried women in particular who have uncertain futures, who are maybe younger and aren't married, or maybe middle age or older and not married, that religion is going to play a very fundamental aspect of their lives. And what that means is their lives revolve around the church, not just kind of in attending church or teaching Sunday school or taking on leadership positions within the church, but taking that, what the church's energies are, and translating that into actually trying to enact some measure of a social, societal change as a result of that. Okay, so women are especially going to start to get more and more motivated during this kind of time period because a lot of times they're shunned. They can't obviously practice in official government proceedings. They don't have, and some are starting to work outside the household, but not nowhere close to half of them even. A smaller number are, but more than that, women are just not necessarily angry or agitated. Some are, but really just want to take their energies and apply them to not just the church, but all manners of life, politics, culture, the economy, all sorts of energies that women especially want to apply for themselves through these benevolent societies, but also even through the church officially. So the temperance movement is going to be a key foundational, fundamental kind of movement that women are going to be especially involved in. And what is the temperance movement all about? Basically, advocates are arguing that alcohol is fueling crime, is fueling disorder, is fueling poverty, and all sorts of other negative antisocial behaviors. And the truth is, alcoholism was rampant, especially in the 19th century and the 1800s. Why? Well, you've heard me talk about this a little bit before. The quality of the water was so unfortunate and poor that people would rather drink alcohol in excess than drink the drinking water because how awful, the horrific the water was. But in general, even beyond that, alcoholism is going to plague society. And again, as I said, the growth of cities are getting bigger. Crime is starting to pick up a little bit. And a lot of people are saying, hey, yeah, we can maybe blame this or that. But really, a lot of these problems are seeming to stem from alcoholism and the excess consumption of alcohol. Okay. So, women in particular, as I said, they're going to get really involved in this movement. And they're going to say, listen, men are working outside the home. They're spending too much of their money on liquor, on alcohol, and are abusing their wives and children as a result. And domestic abuse was pretty high back then as well. Alcoholism played a role in that. And in particular, small towns further west in the more frontier regions, really there was, in some instances, not a whole lot to do. And so people turned to alcohol to cope with the loneliness or isolation in those Western territories. But even in eastern cities, pubs and saloons really were central to so much leisure and social activity of the time, meaning that they didn't have Netflix. They didn't have movie theaters to go to. Theater was something some saw. But there just wasn't a whole heck of a lot to do. So pubs and saloons really played a key role into kind of being a place where people could socialize and people could gather, which also fuels alcoholism. So it didn't matter if you were in the West, you were lonely, you were isolated, and you drank your sorrows away, or even in the East, pubs and saloons, so much a part of that social culture. Regardless, no matter where you lived, there would be reasons why alcoholism was an unfortunate problem during this time. And so what temperance was really trying to do and say is that we need to moderate our consumption of alcohol. Now, some are going to call for outright prohibition, which we'll get to eventually in America too in the 1920s, but some are not saying necessarily to totally give up liquor, but let's just moderate our consumption. And religious leaders in particular are going to preach against the evils of alcoholism and of what liquor is doing to our society. It's leading to more domestic abuse. It's leading to people spending their money not so wisely. So a whole sort of issues as to why alcoholism was plaguing the 19th century. And in 1833, the American Temperance Union is going to be founded, and they're going to outright push for laws that prohibit the sale of liquor, which is going to be a pretty major step. And they're trying to, and this isn't happening on any kind of a national level, but it's starting to be, again, this grassroots voice speaking out against this. Okay. And in 1851, Maine is going to be the very first state to outright pass a prohibition law, meaning you cannot buy or sell alcohol in the state of Maine. About a dozen other states are going to follow suit in 1855. So again, this isn't happening on a national level, and these things weren't always enforced on a super duper high level, but it is going to start to be a concern that more and more people are having, mostly women, but even some men join in on this as well, but mostly women, trying to advocate for temperance, trying to advocate for some sort of a prohibition or at the very least moderation in the consumption of alcohol. So like I said, in 1851, Maine passes the very first statewide prohibition law, and some other states are going to follow suit in the years following that. But again, we won't really get the national prohibition law until 1920. So that's going to take a while before that happens. But the energies of that are already starting at that smaller grassroots level. So trying to reform how the citizens' relationship to alcohol. Also, what we're trying to do is reform citizens' relationship to prison, incarceration itself. Inmates, violent offenders, and debtors, mentally ill, are all crowded together pretty indiscriminately in jails and prisons, meaning that you could have just maybe stole a loaf of bread or not paid your taxes, not something that's really that violent of an offense. But the way prisons were back then, you would all of a sudden be housed next to people who had maybe committed murder or were criminally insane. Okay, so people who really had some serious problems. Maybe you broke a law and you weren't all that bad. You just, cut a corner here or there, and you're being housed with these people and crowded together. Again, the prison system during this time was a joke, and a pretty dangerous joke at that. Okay, all sorts of various tortures that they did to prisoners back then. And again, it's really just about making life as miserable as possible, unfortunately, for so many of these inmates. But beginning in 1816, there is going to be a growth of state constructions of new facilities that are going to attempt to be a better environment for inmates. So during that era of good feeling, some years before, more states are constructing new facilities that, again, are trying to make things a little easier for inmates. And in particular, there's going to be a large emphasis on actual rehabilitation. Can we actually change the behavior, the morality, the values of the prisoner? Instead of just punishing them harsh, let's actually work on trying to reform their behavior, to, just not simply throw them away, throw them in a cell and lock the key, or, lose the key and they're there and there forever. Actually trying to change the behavior and the values of those people. And that's always really what prison should be about. And in many ways, over the years here and there, I feel like we've lost sight of that, right? But there also is an emphasis on rigid discipline in these prisons to rid prisoners of what people at the time called laxness. Laziness is another way to say it, right? That they think, listen, there's a kind of predominant psychological theories at the time said, hey, criminalism comes from laxness, comes from laziness, that if we kind of literally or figuratively beat that out of prisoners and kind of construct a rigid discipline through which they live their lives, that's going to rid them of a lot of the criminality that's plagued their entire lives, okay? Solitary confinement is also going to come about, especially during this time, and that's meant to force prisoners to meditate or consider or think about their misdeeds. The reality is, and this is true even to this day, solitary confinement predominantly has proved to be have an awful effect on prisoners, not just behaviorally, but on a psychological level as well. I've heard stories actually from people who personally I know who worked in prisons who say that you would think the solitary confinement rooms would actually be some of the most quiet areas of the prison. And quite literally, in some cases, they're actually the opposite, because they would walk through these areas as guards or as workers and actually hear people moaning, people wailing as they've been contained by themselves, because actually we're just driving home more and more problems in people's mental states. And so this whole idea that, people are going to just sit and meditate and think about why they're there in the first place, oftentimes that's just not the truth. And in many cases, it actually leads to more criminal tendencies, more criminal behavior, and more so than that, some serious psychological problems as well. So penitentiaries are going to get the nickname or the new name for facilities, and it's meant to echo the idea of penitence or redemption, that we're trying to redeem these people through penitentiaries. So I mostly talked about a lot of kind of negative stuff at prisons at this time, as I should have, but there is going to, even in that, they're trying to say we do need to try to emphasize actual rehabilitation a little more than just simply throwing them in the cell and locking them up for their lives. Again, solitary confinement is going to come about, this rigid discipline, which in some ways has more of a negative effect than a positive effect, but there is going to be an attempt to try to empathize and understand prisoners on a more fundamental level that in the past had just not been the reality. This just shows you in some ways also some other things that they've done to prisoners, kind of putting them in these very, again, the idea of rigid discipline, that we're going to make them kind of stay in this position and think about what they've done. And now we look at a lot of this stuff rightfully and say this is medieval, this is reactionary, this is backwards. And so while they're making some steps forward, I would say in some ways they might be taking a few steps back as well. So really, prison reform is still a problem and something we need to work on as a nation. And it's gotten better here over the years, and in some ways stayed the same or gotten worse. Along with that, mental health is also going to be something that a lot of people are trying to reform and look into. In 1841, a school teacher by the name of Dorothea Dix is going to visit a local Massachusetts prison with her Sunday school class, and she's going to be shocked by how awful these conditions are. Patients are being neglected, the rooms are unheated, and she actually quite admirably quits her career and is going to now dedicate a lot of time to advocating for substantial reform in mental health. And she's going to do a lot towards writing her state legislatures in Massachusetts about the need to new, more modernized approaches in prison. I know my face is kind of blocking this little bottom section here, but really what this does is actually spurs a national movement. So this starts in Massachusetts, but it's going to spread to other states as well, because Massachusetts is at that time very much still one of the most influential, important states across the Union. So she is going to start that there in Massachusetts, and it really is going to lead to the creation of specific institutions for the mentally ill, asylums where it's going to be dedicated towards reforming and educating and giving them skills that are going to do them good if they ever do leave the facilities, right? So asylums, and that usually has a very negative term now because they themselves also could use probably a lot of reform and a lot of changes, but it is going to be a little bit of a step in the right direction. So Dorothea Dix quite heroically gave up her job to try to be more active in mental health and help create asylums that started in Massachusetts but are eventually going to spread all across the country. So that is positive. And again, they also are going to have their own problems, like I was saying, with prison reform, but it is a few steps in the right direction in the end. So education is also going to be a major thing that needs to be further reformed at this time. And in the early 1800s, there's going to be pushes for more public education where governments are funding schools open to all citizens, where, again, you pay those state taxes, and those state taxes are then going to go to kind of creating public school systems. And that was, at the time, a radical idea because, for the most part, schooling happened on the local level, and really you had to rely on whatever resources you had just there to be able to teach your whole community, which oftentimes was not nearly enough. And this is going to be motivated by an increase in the number of voters and millions of immigrants. So we have more people that are voting than ever before. We're going to start to get rid of some like property restrictions that you had to own property to be able to vote, and that opens up where more people can vote. Also, we have millions of new immigrants coming in. So all that means that more and more people realize, hey, we need to really step it up when it comes to education. So these people who are either coming in as immigrants to America, or all these new voters that we need to have voters that are better informed and have better thinking skills. So public education is going to become a much higher priority. Okay. And again, as I said, American leaders and reformers realize and understand we need a well-educated electorate, right? If we don't have a well-educated electorate, how can we hope to get in any meaningful place? Okay. And really, nobody's more educated in almost American history when it comes to educational reform than Horace Mann. Horace Mann, Massachusetts legislature. So again, Massachusetts is having a lot of influence in these reforms. He's a public education advocate. He says we need to double teaching salaries, 50 new high schools, and establish formalized teaching program, meaning that we need to actually have a program that trains teachers in a meaningful way. In the past, it really just came down to people who were volunteers, some people who had maybe taught Sunday school or had maybe spoken at churches. They were seen as people who we can maybe trust to educate our youth. He says, well, that's all fine and good, but we need an actual, more rigorous, understandable, formalized teaching program. So how about that? That'll do us some good. And we need to create more high schools and double teacher salaries. So this will be a more attractive occupation for people to go into. Okay. And in 1852, Massachusetts is going to become the very first state to enact mandatory school attendance law, and New York is going to follow the very next year in 1853, which meant that for the very first time ever, it was compulsory or legal, part of the law that the kid had to go to school. Okay, and that kind of is going to eventually spread across the country. What's the actual focus of what they're trying to teach these kids? Reading, writing, arithmetic, and especially instilling in these kids a work ethic. They're going to go, and because not all these kids are going to be going to college, not even most of them. Okay. So really, more than anything, we need to instill in these kids a work ethic that's going to take them to the next step when they're going to get a job out on their own. And this is going to be supported by local and state taxes, but open to everybody, right? So that's the whole idea. As you can maybe imagine, this is really happening, especially in the North. And it makes sense, right? Because you have these industries and factories are really fueling the Northern economy, so they have more resources and money to spend. Meanwhile, in the South, again, tied to cotton, they have a lot more problems on an economic level. They have a little less money to spend, and so they're going to be a little bit slower to respond as a result, unfortunately. Okay. Again, the very early beginnings of the women's movement, which I already mentioned earlier, is going to start to really kick off in this time period. Because the reality is most economic activity is now taking place outside of the home, where women are now housekeeping and child raising while their men are at work. So that's really creating two spheres of activity, the home life and the workplace. And home is really still where women are going to be mostly relegated to and going to be expected to be at, right? Because women, they're seeing, they're the natural child bearers, child rearing, family, domestic workers of a sense. that the family is their responsibility and it's the man's responsibility to go out and earn a living. Okay, we would maybe look at those things as regressive or not modern now. That was the predominant belief at the time. And also justifications were seen by, well, the world is just too corrupt and dangerous for women, that we need to protect them from the world and they need to take care of their families. And in many ways, that's regressive and misogynistic, I would say, in a lot of ways. But this is going to be heavily solidified by the Second Great Awakening, where women are be expected to be models of virtue for their husbands and their children, where women are really, again, more pressure is put on them than ever before to be mothers, to be wives, to achieve true womanhood. Okay. But a woman by the name of Margaret Fuller is going to come along, and she says, no, listen, women have lives beyond just being a wife, beyond just being a mother, that they themselves have a relationship to God that should be more tied to who they're dictated as a human being. And so she believes men and women are two sides of humanity and should be treated equally. Okay, and again, that we would think of that's common sense now. At that time, is going to be seen as relatively radical. Okay, and she says women have just as much of a capacity to end injustice in society as men do. And if we achieve a more equitable society where women are treated on the same level as men, that can only help the processes of justice, trying to end injustice in a society. So she says, listen, we put too much emphasis on men. Women, meanwhile, really we're just pressuring them to be mothers or wives. And they can be that, but that's not all they should be, that they can and should be more than that in many instances. So Margaret Fuller, again, standing up for that message. So Seneca Falls Convention is actually going to take place in 1848. It's going to be organized by Lucretia Mott and Katie Stanton, two anti-slavery advocates who we'll touch on a little bit later. And this really is pointed at the Seneca Falls Convention as the unofficial beginning of a substantial and organized women's movement. And what they want to do is expand beyond just the rights that are afforded in the Declaration of Independence, that, yeah, all men are created equal, but that emphasis on men. That sounds great, but what about women? And you could even say, well, they meant men and women by saying men, and maybe that's true to an extent, but the reality is women are not being reflected in that democracy that the Declaration of Independence laid out. And Stanton, in particular, says we need to focus on suffrage, which is the right to vote, that if women gain the right to vote, we can actually have a society that is better suited to us and better reflect us. But believe it or not, there's actually going to be a lot of her fellow women who are wanting more rights and wanting more privileges, but are saying, whoa, the right to vote, that might seem like a little much, okay? And by 1860, reformers in the Seneca, who were maybe participating in the Seneca Falls Convention or this early women's movement, are going to pass laws permitting women to retain property in the event of husband's death. And that sounds like something, wait, that didn't exist before. But yeah, that actually was a big deal in, women getting a little bit more rights, is that once these laws passed where if their husband died, they were actually able to retain the property for themselves. It didn't necessarily immediately go to the children, male children, or immediately go to the bank or whoever, that women actually could retain that property in the years to come. And all these things, plus the Civil War and how women fit into the Civil War, and we'll talk about that, are really going to begin to lay the cornerstones and the foundations for a much larger and successful women's movement to come. So there's a lot of reforms to speak of and consider during this time, and we're going to see that that's going to have some pretty big consequences, as it turns out, for really the future of America and particularly American democracy. So this is Mr. Huffman signing off. As always, if you have any questions or any concerns, feel free to reach out to me. Take care. God bless.